Think Star Wars sprang fully formed from George Lucas's brain? Think again. While Americans were churning out cheesy B-movies, Europeans were crafting mind-bending space operas that Lucas obsessively studied. One film even featured a cantina-like scene with alien creatures years before Star Wars existed. Ready to discover the forgotten European films that made Star Wars possible? Barbarella, 1968. Barbarella basically invented the sexy space opera. This wild French-Italian film stars Jane Fonda as a space adventurer who planet hops through a psychedelic universe that looks like what would happen if you let your horny art teacher design the Star Wars cantina. The film's campy tone masks how revolutionary it was. George Lucas actually screened this film repeatedly during pre-production on Star Wars, particularly studying its unique production design. The set pieces are insane. There's an excessive pleasure machine that literally kills people with orgasms, a blind angel with razor-sharp wings, and costumes by Paco Rabanne that influenced sci-fi fashion for decades. Director Roger Vadim created a universe where everything was simultaneously futuristic and ancient, a technique Lucas would perfect years later. Production was chaotic. Producer Dino De Laurentiis sank millions into the project, nearly bankrupting himself. The notorious Italian film unions went on strike mid-shoot. At one point, Jane Fonda threatened to quit when she saw her opening zero-gravity striptease scene, but was contractually trapped. Critics absolutely destroyed Barbarella on release. The New York Times called it the most expensive dirty movie ever made. Yet it became a massive cult hit years later. Now film scholars point to its visual language as the building block for much of Star Wars universe. The strange alien creatures, the retrofitted spacecraft interiors, even the basic concept of a space-wandering hero fighting an evil empire. Without Barbarella, Star Wars might have looked completely different. La Planète Sauvage, Fantastic Planet, 1973. This mind-blowing French-Czech animated film features giant blue aliens who keep humans as pets. Director René Laloux and illustrator Roland Topor spent 5 years creating this hallucinatory masterpiece, working with Czech animators who had to hide their work from Soviet censors who thought the film was criticizing communist rule. The finished product looks like what would happen if Salvador Dali designed Star Wars. The film's political metaphor is impossible to miss. The giant drags treat humans like animals, while the humans stage a resistance. Sound familiar? Lucas borrowed heavily from this resistance narrative for his Rebel Alliance. The film also pioneered the idea of showing alien cultures with their own rituals, art, and social structures, rather than just making them mindless monsters. When the film premiered at Cannes, it caused a sensation. Critics called it visually stunning but incomprehensible. The New York Times wrote, "It makes one wonder what sort of weed the animators were smoking." Despite mixed reviews, it won the Special Jury Prize at Cannes, stunning the mainstream film industry. What's wild is how directly Star Wars borrowed from this film. The meditation scenes with the drags floating their heads into space? Remarkably similar to Yoda's teachings. The strange alien beast humans ride, looking suspiciously like tauntauns. Even the sound design influenced Star Wars alien languages. Ben Burt, Star Wars sound designer, has mentioned studying European animation from this period for inspiration. Yet most Americans have never even heard of this psychedelic masterpiece. Alphaville, 1965. Jean-Luc Godard's noir meets sci-fi masterpiece never shows a single spaceship, yet it's one of the biggest influences on Star Wars story structure. Set in a dystopian future city ruled by an artificial intelligence called Alpha 60, This French new wave classic stars Eddie Constantine as secret agent Lemmy Caution, infiltrating Alphaville to find a missing agent and destroy the computer overlord. What makes it revolutionary is how Goddard refused to build futuristic sets. He simply filmed contemporary Paris at night, making everything alien through strange camera angles and disorienting editing. This found future approach became Lucas's blueprint for the lived-in aesthetic of Star Wars, where everything looks used and weathered rather than shiny and new. Production was guerrilla style. Goddard often didn't have permits, shooting scenes quickly before police arrived. Actress Anna Karina later revealed they filmed one key scene in an actual electricity plant without permission, with workers thinking they were making a documentary. The budget was so tiny they couldn't afford proper lighting, inadvertently creating the noir look that defined the film. Critics were completely divided. European reviewers called it revolutionary, while American critics dismissed it as pretentious nonsense. When Lucas screened it at USC Film School, he wrote extensive notes about how Goddard created a complete fictional universe without expensive effects. The dark corridors of the Death Star, Imperial interrogation scenes, and even the concept of a rebellion fighting against a computerized empire all have roots in Alphaville. Even the name Darth Vader seems suspiciously close to Alpha 60, both being technological villains who speak in monotone voices. Icarie XB1, 1963. This Czechoslovakian space epic might be the most ripped-off film in sci-fi history. When Stanley Kubrick was preparing 2001: A Space Odyssey, he demanded his team study this film. When Lucas was developing Star Wars, he screened it multiple times. Released as Voyage to the End of the Universe in English-speaking countries, this Cold War masterpiece follows a spacecraft searching for life near Alpha Centauri. The ship design is revolutionary. The sleek, clean white corridors of Icarie XB1 are identical to the Rebel blockade runner in Star Wars opening scene. The film features a robot almost exactly like C-3PO, even down to the nervous personality. And get this, there's a scene with sliding doors that make the exact same sound as Star Wars doors. Ben Burtt, Star Wars sound designer, has never admitted sampling it, but come on. Director Jędrzej Polak worked with actual Soviet space program scientists to ensure accuracy. The entire film was nearly lost when Soviet censors demanded cuts of scenes showing crew members dancing to decadent Western music. When American distributors released it, they completely changed the ending, adding footage from other films to make it bleaker. Critics initially dismissed it as communist propaganda, but film historians now recognize it as the first truly adult space travel film. The methodical pacing, the focus on crew psychology, and the realistic approach to space travel created the template for serious sci-fi. Lucas borrowed the lived-in future aesthetic directly, while the ship's corridors are practically identical to the Tantive 4. Even the concept of a diverse crew of different specialists clearly influenced the varied personalities of Star Wars heroes. Danger. Diabolic, 1968. Mario Bava's psychedelic crime thriller might seem like an odd Star Wars influence, but this Italian comic book adaptation basically created the template for the modern masked anti-hero that Darth Vader would perfect. John Philip Law stars as Diabolic, a master thief in a skin-tight black suit who lives in an underground lair filled with futuristic technology, stealing from the rich and battling government forces. The film's influence on Star Wars is unmistakable once you see it. Diabolic's black mask and outfit are proto-Vader in every way. His relationship with his girlfriend Eva mirrors Han and Leia's banter. Even his underground lair with its rotating bed and gadget-filled walls looks like a direct precursor to the Millennium Falcon's interior. Production was absolute chaos. Producer Dino De Laurentiis originally hired Seth Holt to direct but fired him after 2 weeks. Mario Bava stepped in and somehow completed the film in just 12 weeks for a fraction of the original budget. The famous underground lair? Actually shot in Bava's basement with clever camera angles, making it look massive. Critics savaged it on release. Roger Ebert called it completely empty of content. But the film found a passionate cult audience, particularly among film students like Lucas, who were drawn to its revolutionary visual style. The fast-paced editing, the creative camera angles, and the elaborate action sequences all influenced Lucas's approach to Star Wars action scenes. Perhaps most striking is how Diabolik, like Vader, is introduced as a villain but gradually becomes an anti-hero the audience roots for. This moral ambiguity was revolutionary in the late 60s and clearly shaped Lucas's approach to Vader's character arc across the Star Wars saga. The 10th Victim, 1965. This satirical Italian sci-fi film practically invented the deadly game show concept that's now everywhere. Set in a future where people hunt and kill each other for sport and entertainment in a government-sanctioned contest called The Big Hunt, Elio Petri's masterpiece stars Marcello Mastroianni and Ursula Andress as hunters who fall in love despite being assigned to kill each other. The film's influence on Star Wars isn't in its plot, but in its visual world-building. Petri created a future society that wasn't post-apocalyptic, but rather a logical extension of contemporary consumer culture. The vibrant 60s-inspired fashions, the integration of corporate sponsorship into every aspect of life, and the way citizens casually accept violence as entertainment all influenced Lucas's approach to creating Coruscant and the Empire's upper echelons. The production was revolutionary in its approach to future fashion. Costume designer Giulio Coltellacci created outfits that have been copied by sci-fi films for decades. The all-white costumes of the Temple of the Sun sequence directly influenced the pristine imperial aesthetics in Star Wars, while the wild mix of ancient and futuristic elements shaped Lucas's approach to planetary cultures. Critics were baffled by its satirical tone. The New York Times called it a confused mess of styles and messages, while European critics praised its scathing indictment of media bloodlust. When Lucas screened it at film school, he wrote extensively about how Petri created a believable future society without massive sets or special effects. Most fascinating is how the 10th Victim's vision of corporate-sponsored violence and entertainment foreshadowed not just elements of Star Wars pod racing sequences, but the entire Hunger Games franchise decades later. Journey to the Far Side of the Sun, 1969. This forgotten British gem delivered a premise so wild it still feels fresh today. Two astronauts travel to a newly discovered planet that exists on the exact opposite side of the Sun from Earth, only to discover it's a mirror image of our world. Director Robert Parrish created this for Jerry Anderson's production company, the same team behind the puppet shows Thunderbirds and Space 1999, but this was their big live-action breakthrough. The film pioneered special effects techniques that Star Wars would later perfect. Derek Mettings, who later worked on Superman and multiple James Bond films, created incredibly detailed miniatures that were revolutionary for their time. The rocket launch sequences directly influenced similar scenes in Star Wars, with Lucas even hiring some of the same effects artists. Production was plagued with budget issues. Universal constantly threatened to pull funding, forcing the team to get creative. Many sets were literally built backwards to create the mirror world effect, saving money on constructing new environments. The crew worked 20-hour days to finish on schedule. Critics were divided. Science Fiction Monthly called it the most intelligent sci-fi film of the decade, while mainstream reviewers dismissed it as confusing nonsense. It bombed at the box office but found new life on television, where Lucas first saw it while working on THX 1138. The film's most direct influence on Star Wars comes in its space sequences. The methodical approach to showing spacecraft in operation, the attention to technical details, and the realistic portrayal of astronauts working through procedures all shaped Lucas's approach to the X-Wing fighter sequences. Even the concept of twin planets would later appear in Star Wars, with Tatooine's binary suns, showing how deeply this film affected Lucas's imagination. Solaris, 1972. Andrei Tarkovsky's Soviet masterpiece is the philosophical counterpoint to Star Wars' action-packed space adventure. Based on Stanislaw Lem's novel, it follows psychologist Chris Kelvin's journey to a space station orbiting the mysterious ocean planet Solaris, where the crew has experienced strange phenomena. The ocean appears to be a conscious entity, creating physical manifestations of the crew's deepest memories and regrets. Though radically different in tone from Star Wars, Tarkovsky's approach to sci-fi deeply influenced Lucas. The long meditative sequences aboard the space station established the template for how to make space feel lonely and isolating. The scenes of Kelvin walking through the station's corridors directly inspired similar tracking shots in the Death Star. Even Yoda's philosophical musings about the Force echo Solaris's themes about consciousness and reality. Production was notoriously difficult. The Soviet film authorities demanded numerous changes, considering the film too intellectual for general audiences. Tarkovsky battled constantly with censors, who wanted more explanations and a clearer political message. The famous highway sequence showing futuristic Japan was shot guerrilla-style without proper permits. Critics initially found it impenetrable. The New York Times called it the Russian answer to 2001, except it takes twice as long to go half as far. But the film's reputation grew steadily. Stanley Kubrick considered it one of the greatest sci-fi films ever made, and Lucas screened it repeatedly while editing Star Wars. Most fascinating is how Solaris's exploration of memory and projection influenced Star Wars' Force Ghost concept. The idea that consciousness could manifest physically across space seems directly borrowed from Solaris's central premise. Even Luke's training sequences with visions of Vader on Dagobah have their roots in this Soviet philosophical masterpiece. The Final Program, 1973, Robert Fuest's adaptation of Michael Moorcock's novel, was the first glimpse of the new wave sci-fi aesthetic that would revolutionize the genre. Following the adventures of Jerry Cornelius, a hip androgynous secret agent in a post-apocalyptic world, the film blends spy thriller conventions with surreal science fiction elements. John Finch stars as Cornelius, tasked with finding his father's world-saving microfilm while his psychotic brother tries to stop him. The film's visual approach directly influenced Star Wars. Fuest, who previously directed the abominable Dr. Phibes, created a world where high technology exists alongside decaying infrastructure, a concept Lucas would adopt for locations like Mos Eisley. The eccentric, colorful characters populating this world are clear precursors to Star Wars' cantina scene. Production was extremely troubled. The budget was slashed repeatedly, forcing Fuest to get creative with limited resources. Many elaborate sequences from the novel were simplified or cut entirely. Moorcock himself hated the finished film, publicly disowning it and refusing to allow adaptations of his other works for years. Critics were completely baffled. Variety called it incomprehensible nonsense. while Britain's monthly film bulletin praised its daring vision of future society. It flopped commercially but became required viewing in film schools, where Lucas undoubtedly encountered it. The most obvious Star Wars connection is in the character of Cornelius himself. His journey from reluctant hero to savior, wielding an energy weapon and facing a family member turned villain, clearly presages Luke Skywalker's arc. Even the film's satirical approach to fascistic governments influenced Lucas's portrayal of the Empire as simultaneously threatening and bumbling. When people wonder where Star Wars got its peculiar mix of seriousness and humor, the final program is a forgotten piece of that puzzle. Planet of the Vampires, 1965. Mario Bava's gothic horror in space looks like Star Wars' evil twin. When two spaceships respond to a distress signal from an unexplored planet, the crews are possessed by an alien force that turns them against each other. This Italian-Spanish production manages to create an entire alien world using nothing but colored lights, fog machines, and plastic rocks, proving you don't need a massive budget to build a convincing universe. The film's influence on the sci-fi genre is incalculable. Ridley Scott has admitted it directly inspired Alien, particularly the sequence where astronauts discover a massive alien skeleton. But its fingerprints are all over Star Wars too. The crashed spaceship sequence looks remarkably similar to C-3PO and R2-D2's landing on Tatooine. The eerie wind sounds of the alien planet establish the audio template for how otherworldly environments should sound. Production was incredibly challenging. The budget was so low that costume designer Giorgio Desideri made the astronauts' leather suits from leftover material from a previous Roman epic. The famous scene with astronauts rising from their graves was shot with the actors hanging upside down. Then the film was inverted, creating an unnervingly unnatural movement. Critics dismissed it as B-movie schlock on release. Variety called it technically accomplished but narratively vacant. The film found new life in the 1970s when it became a staple of midnight movie screenings, where young filmmakers like Lucas studied its techniques. Most striking is how Bava created a sense of cosmic dread on a tiny budget. The astronauts' vulnerability on the alien world, the psychological horror of watching crewmates turn hostile, and the revelation of ancient alien ruins all influenced how Lucas approached the darker elements of his universe, from the Tusken Raider attack to the carbonite freezing sequence. Without Planet of the Vampires, the entire space horror subgenre might not exist. Fahrenheit 451, 1966. Francois Truffaut's only English-language film doesn't feature spaceships or aliens, but this dystopian adaptation of Ray Bradbury's novel fundamentally shaped how future societies are portrayed on screen. Set in a world where books are banned and firemen burn any they find, it stars Oscar Werner as Montag, a fireman who begins questioning his society after meeting a free-thinking teacher played by Julie Christie. The film's influence on Star Wars comes through its portrayal of an authoritarian regime maintained through technology and conformity. The firemen's clinical precision and black uniforms directly influence the Imperial officer's aesthetic. The sterile, modernist architecture representing the oppressive state became the template for imperial design, while the hidden community of book memorizers clearly influenced the Rebel Alliance's structure. Production was notoriously difficult. Truffaut didn't speak English and relied on a translator to communicate with his cast. Universal Studios constantly interfered, demanding changes to make the film more commercial. The famous opening sequence showing TV antennas instead of traditional credits was Truffaut's compromise after the studio demanded conventional opening titles. Critics were divided. European reviewers praised its chilling portrait of conformity, while American critics found it cold and uninvolving. The film performed poorly at the box office, but became a staple in film schools, where Lucas would have studied it extensively. The most direct Star Wars connection is in the film's examination of technology as a tool of oppression. The wall-sized interactive TVs that keep citizens docile, the clinical efficiency of the firemen's equipment, and the way the state uses technology to monitor citizens all influenced Lucas's portrayal of the Empire's technological terror. Even the concept of rebellion being sparked by access to forbidden knowledge has clear parallels in Luke's journey to understand the Force, knowledge the Empire had tried to eradicate. The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. Nicholas Roeg's surreal masterpiece starring David Bowie as an alien who comes to Earth seeking water for his dying planet arrived just as Lucas was completing Star Wars. This British mindbender follows Thomas Jerome Newton as he uses advanced alien technology to become a technology mogul, only to be corrupted and destroyed by human vices and government paranoia. Though it came too late to influence Star Wars' original production, it had a massive impact on Lucas's thinking for the sequels. The film's non-linear narrative, with its jarring time jumps showing Newton's corruption over decades, clearly influenced the structure of The Empire Strikes Back. The portrayal of an alien trying to understand human emotion directly shaped how Lucas developed Yoda in subsequent drafts. Production was chaotic in the best way. Rogue shot without a traditional script, working from an outline and letting scenes develop organically. Bowie, in the midst of his cocaine-fueled Thin White Duke period, later admitted he was not of this earth during filming. The studio was so confused by early footage, they nearly shut down production. Critics were completely divided. Pauline Kael called it a muddle of science fiction and meaningless sex, while the British Film Institute later named it the 12th greatest British film of all time. It flopped commercially on release, but found a massive cult audience through midnight screenings and college film programs. The most fascinating connection to Star Wars comes through its portrayal of an alien perspective on humanity. Newton's otherworldly perception of human affairs directly influenced how Lucas approached Yoda's character in Empire. Even the visual style of Newton's home planet, shown in brief flashbacks with oversaturated colors and distorted landscapes, seems to have influenced the dreamlike quality of Dagobah. While this film came too late to shape the original Star Wars, its DNA is unmistakable in the strange, mystical elements that would define the sequels. So there you have it. 12 mind-bending European films that created the DNA for Star Wars, most of which American audiences have completely ignored. The next time someone tells you Star Wars changed cinema forever, remind them that Europeans had been pioneering space fantasy for decades before Lucas came along. But I want to know what you think. Which of these forgotten gems are you most curious to watch? Or do you think Star Wars really is entirely original? Leave your thoughts in the comments and let the debate begin over whether Lucas was a visionary or just really good at borrowing from obscure European cinema.